economic needs an enormous input from quite a region. So for 20 to 30 years, you stifle innovation, you stifle alternatives, just in order to keep that monster which you built. So the people of Arecibo are going to see waste coming in from the whole of the island to be burnt on their doorstep, and also probably expect to see waste imported from other islands. That's what this European experience says. And am I making this up? No. Right now, Germany is importing waste to feed its incinerators. Netherlands is importing waste to feed its incinerators. Sweden is importing waste. And Norway is importing waste. And now Denmark is about to import waste. All these countries are importing waste to feed into their incinerator. Because since those incinerators were built, the citizens have woken up and they are recycling and reusing and composting. Rather than celebrate that and shut down the incinerators, they're having to go elsewhere to import the waste. That's what you can anticipate. So in the situation where you build this incinerator, and then your community wakes up and watches what the rest of the world is doing, and you reuse and you recycle and you compost, all that would happen is that waste from further afield comes in to your island. That's not good. Now, long-term contracts. This is the thing that people don't understand. In order to build an incinerator, the company has to get long-term contracts. It has to get commitments from all the towns, whatever, on the island, that they are going to send waste to this incinerator. And they're going to pay for this contract, whether they deliver the waste or not in the future. It's a put or pay contract. Now look, this is a county in England that built such an incinerator. And I want you to look carefully at what the organizers said, and I've spelt it out for you. 10 years ago, the authority signed a 25-year deal with Kent Environmental Power to provide them with 320,000 tons of waste to burn each year. But what was initially seen as a cash-saving opportunity has quickly turned into a money pit as the council is forced to send increasingly valuable recyclable material to the incinerator to meet its quota. In the last decade, many more economically and environmentally friendly methods of waste disposal have also been put into action, making the use of incinerators increasingly uneconomical. Councillor Keith Ferrin, the council's environment spokesman, said it had been a stupid decision in hindsight, but there had been no way to predict changes to the industry. Oops, sorry. He said, the people who thought they were going to be very clever and economical with people's money 10 years ago have produced a situation where the reverse is true, as Kent County Council is now committed to contracts we can't get out of. Now that is something that your leadership needs to read that. These are people that have been through this, that they have been hoodwinked, they've been told how wonderful this was for the economics, how this was the great solution, and now they've woken up 10 years later and they've realized it's a huge mistake. 7, incinerators produce a toxic ash and doesn't get rid of landfills. For every 100 tons of waste that you burn, you get about 30 tons of ash that nobody wants. Nobody wants. And the ash is produced in 2 places. 90% of the ash is what we call bottom ash. This falls through the grates and is collected under the grates. And 10% of the ash is very toxic, and this is captured in these very expensive air pollution control devices. And if anybody tells you that this material is not toxic, then they're telling you that their air pollution control devices are lousy. Because if these devices are good, they are capturing the toxics, in which case the fly ash is extremely toxic. Now I want you to look carefully at what other countries are doing with the ash. We'll come to America in a moment, but what other countries are doing. In Germany and Switzerland, the fly ash, that's the stuff from the pollution scrubbers, is put into nylon bags and placed into salt mines. That's the way Germany handles low-level radioactive waste in Germany. In Japan, the incinerators glassify, vitrify the ash, make it into a glass to try to hold on to the toxics, the toxic metals in the ash. In Denmark, beautiful, clean Denmark have a wonderful solution for their ash. They send it all to Norway. And in the UK, which does things better than anybody else in the world, I'm assured by the British authorities that is true. They are so good, so wonderful, that's why we have Monty Python. Anyway, in the United Kingdom, the ash goes to landfills. Look how secure their system is. And when these people in these houses said, "What's that stuff doing to me?" the British government said, "There's no need to worry. Absolutely no need to worry. None of that ash will leave the facility." And so the citizens set about doing a very, very intensive and expensive research program in which they found road signs. This is a 40-mile road sign. And you can see that it's covered with ash. And this 40-mile road sign is not inside the facility, it's outside the facility. And the British government said, "We're awfully sorry, the ash obviously does get out of the facility. Oh dear, sorry about your children." Ash is the incinerator's Achilles heel. Now, the better the incinerator gets at capturing the toxics, the more toxic the ash is going to be. So what is the ash going to do to workers inside the incinerator, those people in Arecibo who are looking for jobs? What's it going to do to them? And what's it doing to the truck drivers who pick up that ash and dump it into the truck? And to the landfill operators when they're moving the ash around, what's it going to be doing to them? Ash testing, now this is the key. Ash testing does not measure the actual levels of toxics in the ash. Nobody is measuring the ash to find out how much dioxin is in it, how much furans are in it, how much lead, mercury, or cadmium or other toxics in the ash. No one's doing that. So what are they doing? They are doing a leachate test. So they're not protecting people, they're protecting the groundwater. I've just said all that. So the purpose of the test is to find out how much of the toxics leach out from the ash into the groundwater. And here it was shown back in the 1995, when a wildlife pathologist from New York State actually went and tested the ash from Syracuse and from Hudson in New York. And these are the levels that he got of lead. Just take lead. Lead in this ash, 1,400 parts per million. Lead in this ash, 2,650. The level in soil, typical level in soil, 35 parts per million. But that was unofficial, and he nearly got fired for taking those tests. So the questions here: how much of the ash drips from the back of the trucks, because the ash is often wet when it's transported? How much of the fine ash blows off the surface, like you saw in that British landfill? How much is blown off during unloading, during the movement at the landfill? How much of the mercury that you capture in the ash re-evaporates in the hot climate like Puerto Rico? How much of that mercury is going to re-evaporate? how much lead ends up in the surface runoff of water on rainy days. When you just put the ash in there and it rains and the water runs off, how much lead will be in there. And I can tell you that at the moment that it's created, that ash, the lead is very, very soluble, and it will come out immediately when exposed to water. Now the ash, this is what I was talking about before. How did the industry, with the help of government, how is it able to get this ash classified as non-hazardous in the United States? So if you're interested in that little conundrum, it was quite extensive. They used 4 different ways to get the government to change this ash from toxic, which is what their tests were showing, to non-toxic. So this is what I call the Great Incinerator Ash Scam. And if we don't get to it, anybody who wants it will get, and it will be on your webpage, the Colegio Médicos webpage, my presentation, so you'll be able to see all the slides which go into the scam. This scam is useful because when you listen to the incinerator proponents and their consultants, butter wouldn't melt in their mouths. They are so scientific, you would think. And that science completely breaks down when you see what shenanigans they're prepared to do to get this ash classified as non-toxic. And that's what you get. That is a mixed landfill, combined ash landfill, where the bottom ash and the fly ash are mixed together and they're put into a landfill. That's in Haverhill, Massachusetts. It's a landfill run by Covanta. That's what it is. So the whole idea that incineration is suddenly going to get rid of landfills in Puerto Rico is a pipe dream. It's a pipe dream. This is the best. The worst is it's going to be dumped in the sea somewhere or dumped somewhere to save money. But this is the best that you can anticipate. So, argument number 8 then is incinerators put many highly toxic and persistent substances into the air. And you've heard a lot from Osvaldo about this. He's talked about the acid gases. He's talked about the toxic metals, lead, cadmium, mercury, arsenic, etc. And just a few more. I just would like to add a little bit to what Osvaldo said here. Now, there's no known use of lead, mercury, or cadmium in the human body. Just absorb that for a moment. We mine these things in massive tons around the planet, and yet we know that if we get exposed to lead, cadmium, or mercury, it doesn't do us any good. The chances are high it will do us harm. And where are those metals that we use in commerce going to end up? They're going to end up in an incinerator. And where do they go from there? Into nanoparticles. And where from there? Into our bodies. Major concern of these metals is neurotoxicity. Now, I'm going to argue something here, and you may disagree with me. In my view, the most worrying environmental pollutants are those which cause a subtle effect. When a pollutant is disastrous, when it kills people, we find out immediately. Because people are very inquisitive. They say, why are all these dead bodies here? I say, dead bodies? Why are they here? And there's an immediate crisis, there's an immediate inquiry. So they're not a problem from an environmental toxicologist point of view. But the ones which cause a subtle shift, a subtle change, which takes years and years of study before you've identified it, they are the problems. And let me illustrate this with one of them. And I'm going to say in general terms. This is, what I'm about to show you is simply mathematics. It's a mathematics of a normal distribution. But you could certainly think of this as an example of this is lead. When we had lead in gasoline, this is what it did, okay? This is a normal distribution of IQ. any human trait is normally distributed. The bell-shaped curve, whether we're talking about weight or height, whatever, it's normally distributed. So a few people in your society, if we're talking about height, are going to be very short. A few people in society are going to be very tall, but the average person will have an average height. Same with IQ. Now, it's the tails that we have to be concerned about. The area under this curve here, this shaded area, represents the fraction of the total population which is mentally handicapped. And this fraction over here, this green area, the shaded area, is the fraction out of the total area where the children are very, very bright or geniuses. Now, the lead situation. We know now that when we had lead in gasoline, we had a downward shift of the IQ of the population by 5 IQ points. Now, here's the thing. If you were a parent or a school teacher, you would not notice the difference between an IQ of a child at 100 or 95. You could not eyeball it. You couldn't tell the difference between two siblings, one of IQ of 100, one of 95. But now look what we've done to the two tails of our population. Oh my God, we halved the number of geniuses in our society, and we've doubled the number of mentally handicapped. So in all such subtle change, which we are blind to, unless we do very, very careful studies, is absolutely devastating on a population level. And that's what we've got to guard against. That's what we've got to guard against with the pollution from incinerators, which include these nanoparticles, which include these dioxins and furans, and includes these toxic metals. Now, as far as mercury is concerned, quite a long time ago, in 1991, Janet Rayloff, writing in Science News, said as little as a third of a gram of mercury could contaminate a 25-acre lake. A third of a gram of mercury could contaminate a 25-acre lake to the point that a pregnant woman shouldn't eat the largest fish. In 1999, the Syracuse incinerator put out 107 pounds of mercury. That's 48,578 grams. So just how many lakes would you contaminate with that? Okay. Then the incinerator company went about doing everything it could to reduce the amount of mercury which put out, which it couldn't do very well with scrubbers. They had to do it by trying to stop putting mercury into the incinerator. And they got it down, put it about 2 pounds. That's about 1,000 grams of mercury. So even when they tried, they were still way too much as far as the potential to contaminate human beings. Now, here's that incinerator again. Very interestingly enough, there's a small lake, a small glacial lake, very close to this incinerator. And a little mile east of the incinerator. And what did they find? Waste incinerator. They found that walleye and pickerel in this tiny glacial lake are swimming around with elevated levels of mercury, according to the test done by a local professor. Now, 6 out of the 7 pickerel and 2 out of the 6 walleye had mercury concentrations above the EPA guidelines. But here's the point. The glacial lake, a glacial plunge pool, has little or no watershed and gets virtually all its mercury from the air. So there's no proof that mercury in the fish came from the incinerator. That would require more air sampling. But it looks very much like this incinerator has contaminated this lake to the point that it's contaminated the fish. Again, a lot of these things are not absolutely proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, but you know, the precautionary principle should kick in somewhere, or at least careful examination of the issue. before you go ahead and further contaminate the environment. And listen, this is interesting. Unlike most northeastern states where mercury deposits have declined since the 1980s, glacial lake sediments show rising mercury levels since the incinerator was built. Okay, now we go to a subject you've already heard something about, the dioxins and furans that are actually produced in the burning process by mechanisms that Osvaldo was talking about. So I just want to say a little bit more about the dioxin issue from a historical, chemical, and biological. And for those of you who get lost here, because it's a bit technical, don't worry, because there's going to be lots of pictures and simple stuff afterwards when we get into zero waste. So, first of all, talking about dioxins and incineration, we've got the history, the chemistry, the biology, and the health threat that I would like to quickly discuss. The history. In the 1960s and 1970s, people hear of dioxins. How? How do we hear of dioxins? Answer, from Agent Orange in Vietnam. And also, we heard about it from 49 to 76. Dioxins were produced in these horrible industrial accidents like the one that took place in Seveso in Italy. That's where we heard about dioxins, the 1970s. And then, in 1977, oh my goodness, someone discovered that these same horrendous substances were being coming out of incinerators, just burning household trash. And then between 1977 and 1985, engineers argued that we shouldn't worry about dioxin from incinerators because if you ran the incinerators at a high temperature, you would destroy all the dioxins. Not a problem, they said, for 8 years. 85, by the way, was when I got involved. In 1985, a researcher from Ontario called Ashfashik found there were more dioxins formed after the furnace. He measured the dioxins at the furnace outlet, no dioxins. Then he measured the dioxins at the bottom of the stack, the chimney, and there were the dioxins. So somewhere between the furnace and the stack, the dioxins were being formed. That was a shocker. That was 1985. And that was the birth of the so-called post-combustion formation of dioxin. Now the biggest source of dioxin that we get is from animal fat. This is where we get it from, animal fat. And the biggest source of dioxin entering food chains is combustion. All kinds of combustion. Municipal and hazardous waste incineration, cement kiln, backyard burning, fires, copper recycling, metal smelting. There are lots of sources, but where it ends up, as far as we're concerned, is in the food. Now, in the 1990s, it became clearer that with incinerators, modern incinerators had better dioxin control, and many plants were retrofitted and older plants were shut down. So they really got a bit more optimistic now. They could control the dioxin emission, we thought. So, now I'm going to switch. That's the history. Right. Now, the chemical structures. Dioxide-like compounds. 3 families. The PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, PCDFs, furans, furanos, and PCDDs, dioxins. And this is the only bit of complicated chemistry that you need to absorb over the next few minutes. This one. If you could just learn that this substance, which we call benzene, is 6 carbons in a hexagon, with a hydrogen at each corner. And the symbol that we use, so that we don't have to draw that out each time, is a hexagon with a circle in the center. That's benzene. And if you can understand that simple structure, you can understand all these complicated things like 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorinated dibenzoyl-paradioxane. Ah! Most people have a nervous breakdown when you hear words like that. But we can build it like a little Lego set here. So there's benzene. Let's join two together. We call it biphenyl. Just a name. We could have called it bicycle, but somebody else had used that. So we called it biphenyl. Now, if you substitute chlorine atoms for the hydrogen atoms on those two benzene rings, and there's 209 different ways of doing that, you know, whether you substitute 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or whether you where you substitute 209 different ways. That family is called PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. Look at the name. Poly meaning several. Chlorinated means you've put chlorine in. Where do you put them into? You put them into biphenyl. And biphenyl is two benzene rings joined together. So far, so good? Okay. Now, if you should burn PCBs with an inadequate supply of air, what happens is a pesky oxygen atom closes that gap. Remember the biphenyl? You close that gap in the center, form another ring. And that ring is called a furan. Furan. So these substances are called polychlorinated dibenzofuran. The furan is there just to tell you we form that ring in the center. And if you put furans or PCDFs, there's 135 of those, depending on where you put the chlorines. If you put two oxygens between there, you get dioxins. Now, once when I was giving this presentation in Wales, the bulb on the overhead transparent, overhead projector, remember, modern stuff here, the bulb went. So I had to do this with my hands. So I said, right, benzene, biphenyl, PCBs with the chlorine around it. And then imagine a ping pong ball, furans, two ping pong balls, dioxin. Simple. And I loved it in Taiwan. PCBs. I got the audience to do this with PCBs. Okay. Now, we have to number the rings because it turns out that the toxicity of these two families of compounds, of which out of the total 210, there are 17 which are exquisitely toxic. And it depends upon exactly where the chlorine is as to whether or not the congeners, the family members, are toxic. It turns out that these positions, the 2, 3, 7, 8 positions, which are the positions furthest at the end of the molecule, when they are occupied, whether it's a dioxin or a furan, these substances are very toxic. And you can just check. If you go through all 17 of those, you'll find that every single one of them has the chlorines at the 2, 3, 7, 8 positions. They're very nasty substances. These are the most toxic substances we've ever made in a chemical laboratory. One of those is 50 million times more carcinogenic than vinyl chloride, which is not something you want to be exposed to. So, nasty stuff. Now, there's all kinds of others. This is just the tip of the iceberg. We have polybrominated biphenyls. We have polybrominated furans. We have polybrominated dioxins. We have mixed polybrominated and polychlorinated dibenzoyl-dioxin, blah, blah, blah. And we have polybrominated diphenyl ethers. This is what we get when we burn fire retardants in incinerators. Polybrominated dichlorinated naphthalenes, and then in addition to all that, if you substitute nitrogen and sulfur for the oxygen atoms, you get another 1,000 or so substances. So we are literally producing, during this condensation process that Osvaldo was talking about, when you burn it in an incinerator, you literally form thousands and thousands of these very toxic substances. Now the biology. So, the dioxins are fat soluble. That means that they can easily cross the membrane of the cells. When they get into the cell, they find a protein there called the AH receptor. When they can join the AH receptor, this is the dioxins, the blue is the dioxins and furans, and another protein joins the party, and this new complex is then able to go into the nucleus. It doesn't cause mutations, it's not mutagenic, but when it attaches to the DNA, it switches on genes. And when it switches on genes, it produces the production of messenger RNA, which goes to the ribosome and makes new proteins. In short, the end result of dioxins, furans, and PCBs interacting with the cell is the production of new proteins, which can then cause a cascade of consequences. Now, here's the strange thing, the thing that's always intrigued me. There's two remarkable things about this receptor. First of all, after 30 years or more now, because I've been talking about this for years, after 30 years, scientists do not know what this is in the cell for. They don't know what is there. They know more about the interaction of dioxin with this receptor than they know about the cell itself. We know more about the invasion, the aberration of life, than we do about what this part of life was for. And then, the other thing is that we know that this receptor appears in living species, in evolution, at the same time that the backbone appeared in life. And so what does that say? My God. In other words, every single creature that has a backbone has retained this AH receptor. And what would a biologist say about that? Basically, it is fundamentally important to living things, because if it wasn't fundamentally important, it would have been lost somewhere along